Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. And this is our fourth session now on the weekly tech drop-in. So appreciate your support and feedback. So that's good. I am now going to start recording. So everyone, just for your information, I'm just going to start recording. Brilliant. All right. So for today, we have, and we will continue to follow the same model that we've used until in the last few sessions, where we will have a 5-minute tech talk or a tech discussion, where we'll have Rob this morning to present about data privacy and data risk. We will then open up the forum for question and answers. Now, again, as we do every time, the idea of this session is to give you a platform, a forum to ask questions. These questions could be specific to our topic for today. It could be any questions that are around data management or anything that you are seeking assistance from Veritas perspective. We have our lead architects on the call today. We will make sure that we address all the questions that come up on the chat window. We have had some questions come during the registration, so we will go through the questions and their answers accordingly. But if you have any other questions, feel free to type in the chat window. We will also flash our contact information towards the back end of the session, where you could send out any follow-ups that you would want, or we are happy to schedule or have some feedback on what next sessions or topics you would want to see. So with that, let me introduce to you today's panelists. I have Rob, who's our subject matter expert in information governance and compliance. So Rob is going to help us walk through the 5-minute tech session today. And with Rob, we have Patrick Fisher is also a subject matter expert in information governance. So with that, Rob, I'm going to hand it over to you for our tech update. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Amit. Look, welcome everyone to today's session. And look, today, like Amit said, we're going to be talking a bit around privacy and around governance itself. So, what you've got up on the screen, Veritas did a report, actually called our Databerg report, and what is really started to expose around, from what we actually gathered from our research was the amount of data that people have. You think about the amount of data being generated being on devices today, or being on, whether it's looking at say a laptop or it's even like a gaming console. There's so much data being created, and really when we start looking at this information, it's like how much of it gets stored on all our servers, our infrastructure. And when we actually started analyzing that data, we started looking at what was there. We saw that the majority of data, was sort of like that iceberg, right? A lot of data was sitting below the surface, things that that weren't being used, and we coined the phrase dark data. So data that's anything over say 3 years old, that's not being accessed or modified, or created or touched. And what we're doing is, we're just seeing we're just trying to understand it more and more. And then we looked at how much, the data above the surface was. So being that redundant, obsolete, or trivial data, and that ended up being around that kind of 30% mark. And then lastly, that last top bit of the iceberg was really around that mission critical data. And I guess this is the data that, organizations really run on. This is we've heard the word, or the phrase, data's the new oil, kind of oil. And it is something that we look at, and it's how we need to be able to protect this data, how we need to be able to look after it, how we nurture it. It's actually quite important to businesses, and that's where all our businesses pretty much run from. So when we look at it, and we look at the cost of how we manage data, what we end up having to see, and what the guys at Gartner actually did a bit of a review about how much it costs to actually manage data. So when you look at running costs of the storage, the spindles themselves, data center space, it ended up being around $3,000 a terabyte, for over a 1 year period. So when you start multiplying that out, and the example we've got up there is around between for anything between, I guess, for 1 petabyte to 4 petabyte of capacity, that's the kind of number that you're looking at from a per terabyte usable kind of cost. So when you start looking at that and you start multiplying it out, when you look at how much it costs for a petabyte of info, it's about 3.1 million. You start scaling that back to how much some of our organizations have today. We've got environments, a lot of environments are in the hundreds of terabytes at least. So, it does cost a lot of money. So really what we're trying to look at, is that this data, and I guess the cost of all this, data itself, there might be valuable pieces of information in the actual, in all that's going on there. It may contain, illegally held data, things like, like videos, you've got your Game of Thrones and all those kind of things. We see it all the time, and it's not, and all this is going to be growing like without us, really having that kind of complete kind of knowledge. So it does add that risk to the business. So, and then, like I said, the average cost per year for most businesses is around about 700 odd K for storage. So it is important that we need to look at it, and it's the bottom line is really like we don't know what's in there, and it's costing us money. So if we move forward, what we're hearing is that the market is telling us a number of different things. We're hearing around things around growth, fragmentation, ability, governance, and visibility. And quite key for what we're talking about today, and especially with remote, with everyone working remotely at the moment, the amount of data that's being created locally on people's laptops, people, how they're accessing like a file server online, are they, what people are actually touching and grabbing and things like that. We're trying to understand this a bit more. So what we're seeing is that more and more visibility and governance is quite key in this area. So what we end up having, and we look at it from an enterprise visibility kind of point of view, and it's really there around a few different areas. So when we look at it from a governance side, we look at it around being able to capture the information and classify, which is quite key. So being able to find that information that's inside us. So are we looking at PII information? Are we looking at things around, say GDPR or some of our notable, our inventory data breach kind of information, or are we APRA regulated and looking at some of the regulations from APRA? So it's about being able to understand that data, being able to classify it, and I'll touch on classification in it a little bit more. We look at how we can protect and control the access. So, looking at shares within a file system and making sure that we can see what people are, touching, what people are creating. We can then manage growth. We can look at security permissions within file structures to ensure that we haven't like overexposed security to users. We can also look at, our users, touching things that they're not supposed to be touching. So we can go down these different kind of areas. We start looking at around some of the things around the investigation side from a discovery point of view. Looking at as users move, users move to 365 and this big dramatic shift that we've had over the years, but also in this kind of rapid drive forward. How do we actually understand what's there, and how do we need to find that information if we need to in the event of a discovery, and more so around being able to look at that kind of providing easy access to information as well. So being able to visibly, to actually visualize that data, see what's going on, and be able to like report on it efficiently as well. So what we end up having is some of the fundamentals around some of our data management itself. So what you've got up on screen at the moment is one of our solutions, and what we look at here is the ability to actually capture that info, analyze it, and then give you some recommendations to be able to move forward. So what we do here is visualize all your unstructured data. We have around 30 odd plus different kind of data sources, and it varies from being on-prem and the cloud. So when we look at it, we get that information. We then can classify that information. We can then visualize it and see exactly where it is, who are the owners, looking at that kind of redundant, obsolete, trivial kind of data itself, and the data profile of particular users. We can actually then grab that data, and then depending on where it's located, we can then relay that back in a dollar figure back to you as well. So you can start visually seeing what's going on there, and then lastly you can see the last bit around compliance itself. So we can actually drive down that pattern as well. So the way that we look at it is that, I guess personal information, there's a lot of different, things around personal information. Now, most people see common examples around, like our name, signature, these things that have come up on your screen right now. So what we end up seeing is that, it's great that we have this, and and these are some of the things that, like I said, we put into our file servers pretty quickly and easily. Like I know myself, I've got every now and again, I'm sure there's credit card details that are put down, or a bank account number, or I'm sure my driver's license lives somewhere too. Before I go on a holiday, I take a photo of my my passport in case something happens, and we store it and we put it somewhere up in the cloud, because that's what we do these days. We store it all. Sometimes we take a photocopy and put it in our bags as well, but we store it so we've got access to it. The issue is that these things start floating around, obviously, in cyberspace, and we forget about them as well, and where they live and where they then reside. So what we can do is we can start looking at how we can then drive down that conversation a bit more. So what we actually end up having is the ability to see other examples. So when we start looking at other bits of personal information, is you've got employee IDs, you've got races, you've got you've got our DNA, and there's more as well coming up on your screen as well. So when we start bringing these together, like these pieces of information by themselves probably are okay sometimes, but when we start correlating together and we start seeing what's happening with these, we can start then obviously putting more context. So you look at some of the I guess some of the breaches that have occurred, down in Melbourne. There was the one with the My Key cards and being able to work out where certain individuals were on the systems down there. We start can bring these kind of different little mechanisms together, and then we can start visualizing where we could actually find somebody if someone wants to go to that kind of degree. When we look at it, this is where classification sort of comes in, and classification is really built around a few different areas. So looking at it from a few different layers of abstraction. So we're looking at it from like a web application side of it. We look at it from the policy, how we actually then classify that text, and then actually the text extraction itself. So we do policy-based classification, and then what we do here is using these policies, we then can tag that information, we can then classify it, and then from there we can actually then you can utilize APIs to actually extract that information out into other repositories as well. So I guess the last bit that we move towards is really just to give you a bit of a high-level conceptual map of what we're sort of seeing here. So looking at some of the different requirements within the business itself, I guess we identify people with, looking at like sort of different compliance requirements, looking at PII information. Being able to delete data is quite key. We see a lot of customers wanting to, we keep keeping more and more data, but I think we have the ability to be able to get out there and delete data, because I think quite a lot of us are actually scared to push that magical delete button. We don't know what we can delete without that kind of knowledge, and I think the knowledge is quite key, and that's where classification is really important. We need to be able to classify the data, to understand it, to then be able to delete it. The way I sort of describe it is, like data gets born, and just like us, we die at some stage. So it's how, data needs to go through a life cycle as well. And we're seeing more regulations and more kind of concepts coming out around just data management frameworks to drive along that kind of discussion. And the last bit is around cloud archiving. So we see these as some of the requirements, but these are obviously spawned out from different challenges that are out there. So, like I mentioned, it's about having the insight to make the right decisions. Without that kind of insight, we can't go and delete data. We can't go find that information. The data breach itself, we're looking at how, breaches occur because there's problems in security generally, right? And the same with ransomware detection. There's sometimes ransomware is sitting dormant on a file system for a period of time, and then it launches. Some of the solutions we have there can actually help identify that ransomware if it's sitting dormant, and then we can try and take control of it before something happens. The same with the regulatory landscape. Things are moving very, very fluidly these days. You look at like our COVID situation right now and how things transition quite quickly. The ability for our regulatory landscape, and even the privacy landscape between the different states within Australia really are quite changing. I look at Western Australia, and they're looking at bringing their own privacy regulations themselves. Victoria's got their own. You start looking at people over in New Zealand, and New Zealand's got their own, and how they sometimes lead on each other's compared to our Australian privacy principles. So we start looking at how we can start bringing these together. So when these map through from our challenges to our requirements, we start looking at some of our solutions themselves, and these really fall down onto a few of our portfolio, a few pieces of our portfolio. The main ones being our visualization solution, looking at our unstructured data management solution, our archive platforms, being whether it's in the cloud or whether it's on-premise, and also around our classification engine, which is built into every one of these kind of products as well. So whichever solution it is there, it does have that classification engine built into it to enable you to be able to, create, get that insight to make those informed decisions to then really move forward. I guess the key thing that maps back around to the remote workforce right now is, like I mentioned earlier, it's, people are using, the cloud, in a wonderful way. We're looking at teams, we're looking at things, how we can, work remotely and collaborate together. And all these things live somewhere. So sometimes we need to be able to discover across them. We need to be able to classify that data. And we are going to be creating a lot more things in the cloud at the moment or on our corporate systems. So getting the ability to, having the ability to understand it more and do things with it can actually help us out a lot more in the future. So I think that's what I've got right now.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Rob. I think that was a very good overview or a summary in context of, what risks do we run when we decide to keep data? Now, this could be at an organization level or an individual level also. Now, there was an interesting article or a fact that I read earlier this week is, with the decision of not deleting data and continuing to hold content for years together, we are not only adding the risk, but we also have some level of some level of carbon footprint that we are contributing towards. Now we did, and now this is a very different perspective that people have now started thinking about, that the more data you create and the more or irrelevant information that you store is also contributing towards the green effect, as you can call. And that's where now scientists have started to look at what is the proportion of data that can actually contribute towards carbon emission, especially with more and more storage needed. Irrespective whether it resides on-prem or cloud, it is still going to contribute towards carbon emissions. So that's a different research that is going on in parallel, probably a interesting space to watch. So yeah, thanks, Rob. All right, thanks, Rob, for the tech overview. And what I'm now going to go into is some questions that we've received during the registration. Again, to all attendees today, please feel free to type in your question in the chat window. We will make sure that we do a quick rollover every 2 or 3 minutes. We will take questions as we go from the chat window, as well as from the questions that we've got overnight. So the first question, Rob, we had for you today was, our organization has migrated to Office 365. What are the risks that we need to identify when users are creating content in OneDrive, SharePoint, etc.? This is a fairly relevant question with most of the organizations deciding to make the move to Office 365. So probably, Rob, do you want to help us understand the risks?
Yeah, no, that's cool. So look, I guess I probably, you heard me probably mention it earlier. I guess, there's two angles to look at it, and there's there's personal info, there's business info. So, it's how we sort of look at, those kind of two different areas. And what we want to really do is, like I mentioned, is understand that data. And I guess that's probably the key kind of part around it is understanding it is quite key. So once you understand it, you can visualize it, you can see what's going on there. Classification comes into play and is quite key. So, having the ability to classify the data, then gives us the ability to remediate or delete it. So, we do these assessments within our organization, for our customers, and we go out and we can understand. We run some of our software over their environments, and we actually look at what kind of data sets they have, and then we can look at how we can actually remediate it from that point. So more to actually try and find what information could be there. It's being able to understand, is there a PII requirement? Is there like what are the regulations that industry may be going through. So, it does help to build out, a bit more of a deeper knowledge base, and then like everything that gets classified can then be used in like an e-discovery point of view as well.
And Rob, probably a little more extension to the explanation or the answer. When you say classification, the classification actually implies that we are not just classifying the content in terms of this is a picture file or this is a text file or a PDF file, but actually digging further into it, zooming into the content of the files rather than just identifying the file type and the categories, isn't it?
Yeah, well, if you think of it like a file, like a can, what we're effectively doing is opening the can up and getting inside of it and having a look at it and actually classifying all that information within it. So if there was a keyword, if there was a phrase, so for example, if we're looking for, like, say, a credit card number, what we can look for is we can look for the 16-digit character. We can then associate is the word like Amex or Visa or MC or MasterCard next to it, and we can start pulling in a bit more contextual mapping between it to then guarantee more of the success that that's actually a credit card number versus it just being 16 random digits. So we can start pulling those kind of together to then, get that kind of deeper, I guess, success rate as well.
Absolutely, and I think that makes the critical difference here, especially when when people are migrating from an on-prem file share or user home shares mindset into a public cloud like OneDrive. We are now, it's important for us to identify the credit card information that I might have stored 10 years ago on the user home share, and now, as part of the whole bulk migration, everything has just moved on to the cloud. So it's, this classification could be that critical differentiator to identify where my risks are sitting. So yeah, makes sense. Thanks for that, Rob. Brilliant. All right. So then the next question I have comes in context of Enterprise Vault. The first part of that question is EV migration of large amount of data from Australia data center to New Zealand data center. So I think the broader question here is, what are the ways we can migrate an EV archive from one data center to the other, especially over the WAN? Maybe Pat, I'll get you to help us with that answer.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amit. Look, there are a number of ways of migrating Enterprise Vault data from one DC to a second DC. One option could be a simple migration of migrating the data across data centers, and then standing up a new EV server at the other side. Another option is using third-party migration tools to migrate from an existing EV environment to a brand new EV environment, and they could be different versions. The one thing that I'd want to point out is when you're looking at these migrations, is around looking at your data. Now, in this tech update, we talked about knowing what is in your archive and understanding what's in there and removing that risk. So the suggestion and my advice is that we should look at classifying that information and then applying the correct retention. I've been working with Enterprise Vault for the last 10 years, and in the past we didn't have the regulations that we have now around privacy and so forth. In the past we had your typical, if it's a finance related information, I'll keep it for 7 years, otherwise I'll keep it forever. So majority of Enterprise Vault customers normally have a retention policy of I'll keep it forever. So with the current version of EV right now, we have the ability to go in, classify that information, apply the correct retention. So if we find information that is financial, we can put 7 years against it. If we find information that has no relevance to the business, we could apply a short-term retention or even delete it. So that way it's about cleansing what's in the archive and then migrating the data that you only really need for your business.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's a multi-phased approach, if I may say. First, make sure that you have the right level of visibility and optimization built in, and then once you have that narrowed down data set, is when you can actually consider the migration. And again, if you need more details on the paths or resolutions of doing that, feel free to reach out to us on our um, email address now. And we are happy to have a one-on-one conversation just to identify the exact the footprint and how we can help you plan out your migration.
Yeah, and I mean, exactly, with the questions migrating from Australia to New Zealand, there's probably different regulations between the two countries that also need to be thought about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we are more than happy to help you design that solution for the migration. Brilliant. All right, I'm going to keep moving. I have two questions coming up on the chat window, and coincidentally, one of those questions is very similar to what I have received in the registrations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually ask these two questions, and Rob and Pat, both of you could just help me chime in and answer. So the first question that came in from the registered questions was, with people working remotely and accessing the corporate environment via VPN, how can I understand user behavior? And a very similar question that has come up on the chat on, is there a tool that provides a breakdown of where the data is stored, who is the owner, and when it was last touched? So it's pretty much going back into the user behavior, and a follow-up part of that is, where is the data located? So how do I get the visibility of the user activities or user behavior, and as well as the location of the data? So it's kind of a long-winded question, but I think it falls in the same category. Over to you, Rob.
No, no worries. Look, yes, like the short answer is yes, we do have a tool or a solution that can help out there. So what we have is the ability to do like an audit capacity. So and more like audit, or like let's call monitoring. So as files or users are touching like the environment or touching like the file server, so reads, writes, creations, deletes, we can actually monitor that kind of behavior. So for example, if a user was about to leave the organization, we could actually see that particular user has, say, copied a whole bunch of files. They've gone, trawling over the network into different areas of the file system, and you get a full kind of log, so you can see what that kind of behavior is. But we also, the other thing we also do in that sense is we also baseline user behavior. So we can actually, see that, for example, Amit's touching 20 files a day, and then all of a sudden, it's touching 2,000 files a day. We can actually generate alerts around that kind of behavior as well. There's that's probably the other part of it. Pat, did you want to touch on maybe the risk side?
Sure. So we found that throughout time, IT infrastructures grow, and file servers get larger and also grow in size. Now, what we found is a lot of organisations tend to have an issue where they lose a bit of control of what permissions are applied on those file servers. So nowadays, with nested groups, groups being assigned to shares and folders, IT departments tend to now find it difficult to actually find out, who's got access to what. And so with our solutions, we can actually identify, what permissions have been applied to shares and folders, and then from within that, detail, the groups that have been assigned, the nested groups, and then the users that live in those groups. So for one example, a government department in Queensland that looks after child safety, they were experiencing Kerberos token issues. End users were suffering delayed access to file shares. So they used our solution to actually go in and detect how they could resolve those Kerberos issues. And what they found was they had really, really deep nested groups assigned to file shares and permissions. So using our solutions, they'll be able to go and go, oh, wow, we've got 50 nested groups assigned to a file share, and then we've got 5,000 users within those nested groups. From that, they were able to clean up their security posture and clean up their nested groups, and then resolve that Kerberos issue, resolve the end user experience. So that's the great thing from a security angle and a risk angle, is being able to take back control of the security and access provided on your file service. Classic example is you might accidentally have the IT team that has access to payroll information. That could be seen as a big no-no to the risk and compliance team. So with our solutions, we can identify that and help resolve.
And just to add probably one more little thing there. Sorry, I mean, and so, so just with the risk side, just to touch on that just a speech more, we basically give everyone a risk score in the organization. So what you end up seeing, you get a stack rank of the organization of every single user. And that risk score gets applied to the amount of permission that's been allocated to those users. So what we can then see from that is, like I said, from some of these assessments I've done, like I did one in South Australia, and I had a customer that had everything. The 99 was basically every one of their domain admins, and then they had a score of 68 for everyone else on their file system, which sounds good because everyone's sort of the same, and they've got their distinct line between admin and users. But the problem was that it was like, the photocopier still had 68% was as a risk score, and then the receptionist still had the same score, and every single user had the same score. So that organisation ended up having a pen test, and they had one of their accounts were compromised, and that pen test then took out a bit of their file server data. So like Pat was saying, it does come down to being able to understand it, and another classic example is where I've seen like an admin has promoted his, ordinary account. So all of a sudden you see the admin account and then his normal user account directly below in the stack rank. So there's different things and different ways you can use it to be able to see what that is. And the last thing is we can also then see it from a geographical point of view as well. So depending on how your organization is laid out and where you're collecting data from. So one of our solutions provides that visibility layer from a geographical view. So if you've got like a global organization, there's footprints all around the place. Basically, you can visualize those. You can click on the basically there's a circle. The bigger the circle, the more data. You can then click on each of those pieces of those circles, and then you can start exploring it a bit deeper. There you go.
Cool. And can I just follow that up, Rob, for one more bit of questions, where if now that Pat and you both have identified how we can get the user patterns and identify who owns what is the activity happening, now we also know what data sits at what location. It could be a geographic location. Now, if I apply the classification lens on top of this data, I have an end-to-end story clearly identified, isn't it? Where I have a user behavior, a user mapping, and content classification. So I can easily draw a line where which users are trying to access what information. It could be, finance information or personal information belonging to a particular data set. So, that gives you a complete correlation of what your risks are, and if that particular user account is compromised, what is the level of damage that it can cause?
Yes, no, that's right.
Brilliant. Thanks. Cool. All right. So let me move on to the next question. The next question is again around Office 365, where maybe Rob and Pat, I'll help you or I'll ask you both to answer this one. We have migrated to Office 365. What are our considerations for archiving and compliance needs?
Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, I'll take the first bit, and then Pat, you can jump in as well, mate. Look, I think the key thing is to look at, obviously, what the kind of the need for keeping data is probably the idea, I guess, from a compliance point of view. We're looking at more having like I say, if you're looking at like having an immutable copy, so having a true journal, that's probably one of the key first points that I usually talk to about, with organisations, how to actually journal information and keep a true journal. So having something broken away somewhere else so you can then have it as that immutable copy. That's probably the biggest kind of talking point when it comes to, from a compliance side. Different industries have different regulations and how long they need to keep their email data for. So, it comes down to whether your organisation sees the thing, is email the true record? A record usually belongs in a record management system. So there are different ways that this gets discussed. I guess like I said, the real compliance comes down to what is that kind of justification around keeping the data itself, and then in turn it can then lead down, like say, a discovery path. I'll let you as well, Pat, chime in on this.
Sure. With Office 365, now with the ability of retention policies and so forth, you can determine how long you keep data within your archives and within your mailboxes. But as Rob had led into, if we are looking for an immutable copy, then enabling exchange journaling and then having a copy stored in a third-party location. From a discovery perspective, e-discovery has a number of challenges. With Office 365, there are e-discovery capabilities. They do get higher as you go up the Office 365 offerings, if you're going from E3 to E5. However, when performing discoveries, the challenges that you have with Office 365 is its limitations of the number of searches you can perform. If you're looking at particular data within the organization, you're going to have to run multiple searches across multiple mailboxes, and that can take time. By having an immutable copy and storing into an archive solution, you then have the more defined e-discovery capabilities. The data's archived, it's indexed, it's classified. You can then, use some of our solutions to then find that information far quickly, and also reduce the amount of information that you actually take out from the environment. So, if you look at Office 365, doing those multiple searches, exporting to PSTs, you end up extracting quite a large amount of information that you then need to pass on to someone else, and then that actually increases a lot of time and effort and cost associated to finding what you're after. By using the e-discovery integration with a third-party archive, you can actually put the search criteria and find that information far quickly and be able to export the data that you really need to then pass on to the required teams that request that information, and therefore also making their life a little bit easier by not giving them a stack of data that large, but more of a stack of data that high. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, it did. And what I'm also understanding is, if you have a standardized compliance process, or let me not just be very vague here. If you have an e-discovery process which has been, validated and been running for years, when you migrate into Office 365, of course, there is going to be some level of change, and we don't really want to change the e-discovery process because it has legal implications. Now, if you are able to maintain that standardized e-discovery methodology without really disrupting how people do it or retraining people, that makes a lot of sense. And again, the limitations or the gaps that you just identified could expose you for even further risk. So I believe it's good to have a consistent approach of e-discovery before and after migration to Office 365. So, yep, that makes complete sense to me, Rob and Pat. Thanks.
exactly. And also to add, e-discovery, is normally a function that is performed, sort of, outside of IT. But it's seen that it has to be an IT function. IT has to be involved in performing the searches and performing the extractions. And this is where there's solutions out there like ours that actually can take away that ownership away from IT and hand it back to the requesters that want to perform those e-discoveries, like your legal, your risk and compliance teams. So they, giving them the tools to actually go out there and find that information, whereas IT then just has to manage the platforms that hold that information versus being involved in doing those searches and so forth.
Yeah, I totally agree. Brilliant. All right, let's keep moving. The next question I have is I'm going to take the question on the chat window now. The question is, what are the approaches to classify unstructured data, such as photos, etc.? And maybe, Rob, I can get you to help us with the answer.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Thanks, Amit. So yeah, no, look, Spencer, thanks for that. That's a good question as well. I guess one of the first approaches I sort of look at is, I guess, with the classification engine that we have, it sort of has those 5 elements. So that text extraction, so converting Office documents to text, the classification bit, so we use policies to classify the documents, and basically the result of that is the tags. Then we have the policy management, I guess, itself. So that's the enabling that kind of the built-in policies, the custom policies, depending on how you want to be able to, classify your data, and then the ability to then see that data itself. What we do is, from the patterns themselves, I guess what we have is those other kind of parts of it. So when we start looking at the different patterns, so like keywords and proximity searching, whether it's around like a regular expression, so it's looking at certain kind of traits. I guess what it really next comes down to is more around, so for example, photos. Photos are a bit of a difficult one, purely because it depends on what kind of imagery we're talking about. If there's something from an OCR capability where we can pick out a keyword within a photo, then we can. I've got customers more in the geo space who still find it a bit challenging. They've got some specialized solutions that actually look at those kind of more pure photo kind of areas. So that's probably a bit of a more specialist kind of area. We do still use things like named entity recognition and document similarity as well, from a classification side. So looking at the different types of data out there, I guess probably the key thing is what comes in with our solutions is, we've got roughly about 800 odd policies that are already predefined. So there's Australian Privacy Act, the Privacy Act comes in. There's you can start searching across say Australian licenses, Medicare numbers, our own passports. But then there's the more global ones as well. So if the organisation is looking to try and be a bit more, vigilant around that kind of side, then those can be applied. We have more security-based ones. So looking for say usernames and passwords. So every now and again you might get one of your users who decides to put their password in a text file. Even admins, we sometimes have done it in the past. I'm sure when I've done deployments in some of my environments, you don't want to type the same password 100 times. So you type it in a text file and copy paste it 100 times instead. So it does happen. So I guess that's probably, it really comes down to the nature of what you're trying to get from the classification side of it, and then following on from that is that then gives you that, I guess, that knowledge itself. And that's probably the key one is, once you've seen that, and then once it's visualized for you, you can then actually really quickly see, I can then go, okay, I'm going to pick on Amit again. So I can click on Amit. I know that in Amit's got, stuff in his OneDrive, and in his OneDrive, he's got these type of things. So there's some personal information, there's a credit card number, and you can actually visually see those tags that are then applied to Amit in his OneDrive location. Or you could go, okay, I want to click on the OneDrive location for all my users and see what tags have been applied, from that view as well. So it gives you more knowledge. So it's around the knowledge side of it more than anything. And then from that knowledge, then you've got the ability to take action. So what we sort of talk about at Veritas is, it's sort of like a 3-step kind of approach. You look at finding that information, you then act on those findings, and then really you're evaluating that risk as well. Or evaluating your risk. So there's that kind of three-phase kind of approach. So find, filter, act is probably the three things I should probably more lean towards. I hope that has answered that question.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of identifying content that generally we don't consider it to be a risk-prone aspect. So yeah, as you rightly said, I myself have created files where I have my passwords put in. I also have my usernames put in, and then I just forget about where I kept that file. So it's a risk. It's not just a risk to the organization, but it's a personal risk as well. So it just makes a lot of sense to have that visibility of knowing what's sitting where in my hard drive or in my data center. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Cool. And again, if you have any follow-ups on that question, or if we didn't answer the bit that you're looking for, feel free to put in the chat window, and we can revisit if time permits. We move on to the next question, and I think we have a very similar question coming up from our registrations as well, which says, how can I understand my redundant, obsolete, trivial, the rot data to identify potential files to remove? So this is basically getting into the delete aspect of the story. Pat, if you could help us with your thoughts on that.
Sure. Look, as we've talked about it a number of times. It's one is being able to identify what that data is. Sometimes it's quite easily to see, storage of log files, for example, or text files. But then, other times, there might be a large amount of data that hasn't been accessed in a long time, but we're unsure of what content those files contain. So this is where classifying that data will help identify redundant, obsolete, and trivial files, and then allow you to make that decision to then delete. Right? And everyone's kind of guilty of it. For example, within Veritas, we've got a lot of product documentation that gets updated when there's a new release. We tend to hold on to those preview files. So then over time, over the years, you end up this data becomes obsolete. Right? And as you mentioned, we create files, then we forget about it, and we store it, and then it's being backed up, and we're storing it. And we're paying to store that rot data. So this is where one is finding what it is, determining sort of the age of the data, determining if it's been accessed, and then being able to classify. And then once you kind of tick all those boxes, you can then go back to IT like the business, saying, look, we've found all this amount of information that's sitting on our file servers. We're storing it, we're backing it up. It's adding a cost to our business. Here's what I've got. Can we delete it? Right? And then with classification, you might find that some of that information might contain information that we may need to keep. So it gives the business that informed knowledge to then make that informed decision. Right?
Absolutely, and that decision may not be delete at all times. I mean, it may also mean that I'm pushing it into a lower tier of storage. When I say lower, it is a cheaper tier which is not being backed up, but we still have a copy for evidence. So
exactly.
The ability to decide is the key here.
That's right. It could be like an archiving solution, right? I can then archive it, and then that solution can have an indexing capability, which I can then search for it. Because the fact is, storing files, one of the challenges is finding it. So if you have to identify those files, move it to somewhere else, have it indexed. So then when you do need to find it, you've got a really easy search capability. It's going to make life a whole lot easier.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. That's a brilliant way of looking at it. Okay, so the next question I have is, again, getting into Office 365 And oh, that's good. It's still on e-discovery. So maybe Rob, I can get you to help us with this. We run in Office 365 today and have a number of e-discoveries across emails. However, we struggle to discover across file servers. Or I'm guessing that this is around unstructured data e-discovery with OneDrive or Box, or even on-prem file servers could be in scope.
Yeah. No, look, thanks, Simon. Yeah, it does. Yeah, Office 365 is a bit of a hit, isn't it? It's how it is, I guess, in the industry these days. But I guess, look, from I guess from a discovery point of view, I guess it depends on the nature of the discovery, right? So obviously 365 has its own discovery tools which capture around the 365 world, and that's great. I guess what we can provide, is probably a little bit further from that space as well. So I guess when you look at classifications in my mind now, I've been talking about it too much. When you look at e-discovery, you're looking at basically grabbing a large volume of data and then putting it down to the relevant information. So what we start doing there is, we can look at like being able to identify. It's all around preservation and collection of data. They're quite key, and then it's going through the processing, review, and the analysis of that information itself. So I guess what we can do, we've got a solution where we can look at 365 in itself. We can then look at file servers. We can look at, like, say, I guess, desktops or SharePoint and different things, and actually throw the net across in one big hit versus having to do individual discoveries, I guess. And that's probably the key thing. I think a lot of the time, e-discoveries can be a time-consuming process, and then when it comes down to that kind of export and then handing it off to legal counsel, what we end up seeing is that there can be massive bills that come out of that as well. So what we've got is a solution. Our e-discovery platform, can actually try and help alleviate those costs. So being able to get down to that more relevant piece of information. So it's the common. There's a reference model called the Electronic Discovery Reference Model, so EDRM for short, and that's basically what all kind of discovery processes go through. So what we find there is it's being able to capture in one bigger hit versus having these separate kind of processes. And look, even our solution can hook into 365 itself and do file servers at the same time. So if you're looking for keywords across both those different data sets, being unstructured or structured, or being semi-structured, let's call email, we can go down that path. Hope that's answered that one.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the consistency of the search on-prem and cloud gives you I like the way you used throw the net wider. And yeah, it actually makes a lot of sense where we can actually put in the same search or rediscovery criteria for on-prem and cloud workloads. Perfect. So that's that. I am now going to take the next question. Wow. Again, Office 365. Maybe Pat, I can get you to help us with this. Is there anything I can do before I plan my migration to Office 365 to reduce information risk? Good question. Pat, did you want to give me your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Look, I take the analogy of moving homes, right? So over time, you end up accumulating a lot of stuff. Take the classic garage or garden shed. You end up sort of just keeping boxes of old stuff so that's been sitting there for so long. And as it grows, you tend to forget what you've kept. Same thing goes with information. I've actually sort of looked back on my personal file shares and found that I've been keeping data back from 2008 and totally don't even remember what that information was for. Right? So it's always a good opportunity to say, if you're moving house, it's time to do a cleanup, right? Time to get rid of all that stuff in the shed and the garage that you've been keeping, and apply that to your file data. So using some of the solutions that we provide, and we can help customers identify that data, determining what data is dark, what data is redundant, obsolete, trivial, applying classification on that, and then from that, once you've got that visibility, you can then move the information that is important to Office 365. You might find that there's information that sort of has some risk characteristics that you may not want to move to O365. So to primarily understand what you've got, that can definitely help you, sort of move the information that makes sense. Reduce that migration overhead as well, and reduce those project timelines. Right? And then the stuff that you don't need, delete.
Agreed. And given that the migration process is still a long process, it might just take months for the migration to happen. It might be a good idea to keep monitoring during this migration phase where, in my personal experience, unstructured data grows year over year. This is far more than, what you would expect a database to grow. But in that context, if my organization is taking about 3 months to migrate from on-prem to Office 365, it is actually going to give a clear growth during that period as well. So it's not just a one-time activity. It might just be an ongoing activity for the next 3 months or so when the migration completes. And then that gives you the confidence that you've cleansed it. You've got only the relevant information and the rightful information that needs to go into the cloud. So that's good. All right, brilliant. I think we have one more question on the chat window, but we are fag end of the hour. Let me. So the question is coming in context of getting data identified as well as removing it from backups. But given that we don't have enough time, can I request you to please send us that question or that email, because WebEx does not really give us your email address. So if you're able to just put in, just copy paste this question and send an email to anz.team@veritas.com, we'd be happy to give you a detailed view of, what that response looks like. And I'm just being conscious of time, and this could take a little longer as the question is a good discussion topic. So, but thanks. I'd be happy to respond to you over email. All right, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to take an opportunity to introduce you to the next topic that we have coming up. And next week, which is 6th of May, is when we will have the disaster recovery piece covered. Now we will have, we basically want to talk about disaster recovery. What are the key aspects of disaster recovery 101? And if you have any questions related to disaster recovery, now this could be in context of the pandemic, this could be in context of disaster recovery testing or validation, feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to, hold a very similar session with question and answers and a 5-minute tech update. So happy to take it from there. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really happy that, we've made right use of the 60 minutes that we've had. And thanks to Rob and Pat for hosting all the questions and giving us the right responses. So thank you. Stay safe and speak to you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Amit.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye.